I will now start to speak about the reason we are all here, which is Judeo-Persian. But before talking about the Judeo-Persian or the Judeo side of things, just let's have a short explanation about Persian and its spread. Persian is an Indo-European language that belongs to the Iranian branch of the Indo-Iranian languages. And more specifically, it is a southwestern Iranian languages that directly descends from Old Persian, the language of the Achaemenid inscriptions, and Middle Persian, which is mostly known from the writings of the Zoroastrians. When we speak about the spread of the Persian language, we should bear in mind that the geographical area in which Persian is spoken exceeds the modern state of Iran. Varieties of the Persian language are also spoken in Afghanistan, where it is usually called Dari, and in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, where it is called Tajik. Historically speaking, it would also be suitable to use the term the Iranian world or historical Iran. This is a wide area that stretches from Iraq in the west to Pakistan and China in the east, and from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Caucasus and the Central Asian steppes in the north. During the 1st century CE, many Iranian languages and peoples inhabited this area, and many Iranian languages were spoken in this area. But these languages were eventually extinct, while Persian, the Persian language extended from its home in southwestern Iran to the entire Iranian plateau and further east and west even. So consequently, the Persian language was diversified into a large number of local variants. You have this language across so many different areas in the pre-modern period, and naturally it would develop and have certain dialects of its own. As for the Jews of the Iranian world, so during the 1st centuries of Islam, one can find Jewish presence nearly in any region of historical Iran, from present-day southwestern Iran, the region of Khuzestan and the region of Fars, to northern Afghanistan and western China even, the area of Khotan, which we will shortly mention. In many cases, we know about the presence of Jews in a certain settlement, but no more than that. We know from particular sources that there is Jews in the city of Balkh, Jews in the city of Shiraz, and so on, but not more than that. Further on, moving further in history, during the early 13th century, the Mongols arrived in Iran. And from the Mongol period onward, Jewish presence is documented mostly in the western part of the Iranian world, which roughly makes up modern Iran. Its borders delineated here. However, Jews resettled in the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand in present-day Uzbekistan, sometimes in the 14th and 15th century. And as for Afghanistan, well, we know Judith mentioned the Afghan Geniza, where we know that Jews were present in the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries up to the Mongol invasion. But after that, Jewish presence in Afghanistan was renewed only in the 19th century with the formation of the community of Herat. This community existed from the mid-19th century to the 1940s and 50s. So after this short historical background, let's move to talk more about Judeo-Persian language. The Persian language used by the Jews of the Iranian world is of course referred to as Judeo-Persian. The Judeo-Iranian dialects that were spoken by different Jewish groups in Iran. For example, we have Judeo-Yazdi, Judeo-Isfahani, Judeo-Shirazi. Every town, every city, and its own Jewish dialect, which are sometimes unintelligible to one another. I'm not talking about these dialects which are not, linguistically are not Persian, but I am referring to the varieties of Persian that were spoken and written by Jews, and more specifically, since I'm dealing with manuscripts and written material, I am referring here, I define for this, for our purposes, for this lecture, Judeo-Persian, any form of New Persian written in Hebrew script between the 7th to the 20th centuries. Now, it is also important to bear in mind the linguistic variation of this language. It is not a single uniform language, but rather varieties of New Persian that differ from one another: vocabulary, syntax, morphology, phonetics, lexicon. This is particularly true for the Judeo-Persian of the first centuries of Islam, which is termed Early Judeo-Persian. I will use the term Early Judeo-Persian during my lecture. The first part of my lecture will deal with this Early Judeo-Persian language and literature, and I will then turn to discuss later Judeo-Persian, classical New Persian, which is attested from the Mongol period onwards. So what is Early Judeo-Persian? Early Judeo-Persian is the oldest layer of Judeo-Persian, which is datable to the pre-Mongol period. That is from the advent of Islam, more or less, up to the early 13th century. It has quite unique and distinctive characteristics in comparison to contemporary New Persian, written in Arabic script. We could call it Muslim New Persian. And it also differs greatly from later Judeo-Persian. What is the difference between early Judeo-Persian and contemporary or New Persian, Muslim one, written in Arabic script? So first we have to know that the dialects of Persian were restricted to colloquial usage. They did not find their way into the literature written in Arabic script, with a few exceptions, of course. In New Persian literature, the language became relatively fixed and standardized at an early stage. But early Judean literature somewhat escaped the influence of New Persian writing in Arabic script. And therefore, we find differences in orthography, in grammar, in vocabulary. A stark example of the liberty which a Jewish writer takes in writing early Judeo-Persian could be given here. This is a letter that was part of the Afghan Geniza, where the Jewish author clearly disobeys the rules of New Persian orthography. So the writer occasionally writes the ultimate word in a line in Arabic script, like here. In the example before us, we see the same expression in two different forms. In the first instance, the first word is written in Hebrew script, while the second word is written in Arabic script. Farman bordarum, literally, I am obedient. Now, when the word is given in Arabic script, like here, the author follows the orthographical conventions of his time. However, the same expression appears also in Hebrew script, a few lines below. And here, the author resorts to a more phonetical way of writing, here with a bordarum with a vav that should not be if we follow the orthography of, let's say, Muslim New Persian. This is a very small example, okay? This is just deal with a very specific case of orthography, but to me, it seems like a gateway to a whole world of differences from Muslim New Persian that the writers of early Judeo-Persian had. And this suggests that the Jewish authors were not obligated to the linguistic conventions that were fixed by their Muslim environment. Early Judeo-Persian is also unique for another reason. It is not, again, a single unified language, but as Shaked puts it, early Judeo-Persian is in fact several varieties of New Persian used presumably in as many different localities in the Persian-speaking world. Now, this variance, where you have many forms of early Judeo-Persian and not just one, could be attributed to the absence of a central authority that provides any models of literary writing and provides uniform orthography and grammar. Different literary forms of early Judeo-Persian, for that reason, reflect to some extent the vernaculars of the authors. It is important, though, to note that we are not talking about the early Judeo-Persian is not a documentation of dialects of Persian. Early Judeo-Persian authors attempted to write in a high register of literary New Persian, but for the lack of, let's say, I wouldn't like to use the word miseducation, but they did not go to the educational frameworks of the Muslim majority, and due to the absence of a central authority, what we get is an attempt to write in a literary language, which is in the making. It has not been standardized yet, and it reflects the author's vernacular. Now, this variance, thanks to the efforts of scholars such as Gilbert Lazare and Shaul Shaked, thanks to their efforts to trace and find the differences between the different early Judeo-Persian variants or varieties, we can now state several different varieties in the following regions. The most prominent are Khuzestan, which is in southwestern Iran. The Khuzestani dialect of early Judeo-Persian is prominent in many documents. Another group of documents that have more or less the common linguistic features, there are those from Afghanistan or, historically speaking, Khorasan. So it's another group of early Judeo-Persian documents that has the language, that reflects the language of Afghanistan or Khorasan in the medieval period. And there's a third variety assigned to Bukhara by Shaked or to northwestern Iran by Gilbert Lazare. Still debatable, and each person takes his own opinion. Now, although early Judeo-Persian makes the lives of those studying it very difficult for these reasons, it is also a blessing. Why is that? It provides crucial information for the linguistic situation in the Iranian world during the first centuries of Islam. And it is a very important source for understanding the evolution of the New Persian language for these reasons. In fact, the earliest attestations of the New Persian language are written in Hebrew script. So let's see them. The first is are two letters, or maybe they belong to the same letter, which are usually called the Dandan Uylik letters from the early 9th century. They were found in the ruins of a Buddhist monastery in Dandan Uylik, which is in the region of Khotan, located today in present-day Xinjiang province in Western China. So the Dandan Uylik letter was found in the early 20th century, and in the location itself, in the archaeological site itself. In the early 21st century, a second text was found or retrieved by a certain individual, which is very similar to the first, and today it is held in Beijing. These texts were probably written again by the same person around the early 9th century. The language here in this letter is fascinating. The content too, but today we're focusing on the language. It reflects a very early stage of New Persian writing. And as Zhang Zhan, the scholar from Oxford who studies them, he calls it an embryonic New Persian, not even early. Another attestation of New Persian in Hebrew script, a very early one, comes from southern India, from Kerala. So in Kerala, in the mid-19th century, there are a few copper plates from southern India that have several short declarations of witnesses in Arabic, in Middle Persian, and also in Judeo-Persian. Historically speaking, it is very interesting that at that period you have Jewish presence in that period, in that area of South India, probably of merchants from perhaps the Persian Gulf. We usually, when we study the Cairo Geniza, for example, the India trade appears much later in the 11th and 12th centuries, but here we have Jewish merchants probably from again the Persian Gulf area that appear in South India. Now, the third example given here is the Tang-i Azao inscriptions, which are dated according to the editor of these inscriptions to the mid-8th century. They are probably the earliest. These inscriptions were engraved by 3 passers-by who inscribed their names on a rock in the site of Tang-i Azao, not far from Herat in western Afghanistan. Henning, who published this text, dated it again to the mid-8th century, based on a sequence of letters which he identified as the year according to the Seleucid era. This is the order of the letters. But the order is quite problematic, as the first letter should be the last if it is dating according to the Seleucid era. So this inscription is quite problematic, but in the meantime, until this inscription we examined, we consider it the earliest attestation of early Judeo-Persian, probably of the New Persian language. Now, these are, again, the earliest attestation of early Judeo-Persian and of New Persian in general. However, most of the texts in early Judeo-Persian are later. It is assumed that most of the writings that were produced by Persian-speaking communities in pre-Mongol Iran did not survive. Most of the extant early Judeo-Persian texts are datable to the 11th and 10th century, not 9th and 8th centuries as we've seen. They come mainly from 2 regions that are very remote from one another: Egypt, specifically Cairo, and Afghanistan, specifically the city of Bāmiyān. As we can see on this chart, there are very little pieces or writings of early Judeo-Persian from other parts of the world, Iran and China. So Cairo is the Cairo Geniza, or Genizot in plural, is the largest source for early Judeo-Persian texts. It makes up around 70% of the total pages written in early Judeo-Persian. The early Judeo-Persian texts were retrieved from several locations in Cairo. First and foremost, the Ibn Ezra Synagogue, the Cairo Geniza. Its materials are presented here. And you see this famous Solomon Schechter studying them meticulously. But other sites also contain early Judeo-Persian texts, the Basatin Cemetery, for example, and the Karaite Dar Simcha Synagogue, which I will mention shortly. The other major source for early Judeo-Persian is a group of documents belonging to a rich and diverse trove of manuscripts that was discovered in the area of Bāmiyān. As far as we know, at least, this is what the antique dealers tell us. So since this trove contains a significant portion of text in Hebrew script, it was dubbed the Afghan Geniza, though we don't know the last location of the documents or where even if they were found together. So for now, we just have to take the word of the dealers who found it or who hold it right now. So these are the two prime locations for early Judeo-Persians that we have. In terms of genre, the early Judeo-Persian texts present an impressive array of genres. We have poetry and magic, documents, Jewish law, and much more. And as it can be discerned from this table, the tafsir genre, namely glossaries, translations, and commentaries on the Bible, is the most prominent genre. Most of these exegetical manuscripts originate in Cairo. More specifically, the bulk of the early Judeo-Persian exegetical manuscripts, or those belonging to the tafsir genre, hail from the Karaite Dar Simcha synagogue. Indeed, these are very early Karaite exegetical works written in early Judeo-Persian. In the late 19th centuries, two individuals managed to put their hands on manuscripts from this synagogue, Abraham Firkovich and Moses Wilhelm Shapira. Firkovich, the famous Karaite leader and scholar, and his family sold the manuscripts to the Imperial Public Library at St. Petersburg, today the National Library of Russia. Shapira, on the other hand, sold his manuscript, which he obtained from that synagogue, to the British Museum, and today they are held at the British Library. The provenance of these manuscripts, namely the Karaite synagogue in Cairo, might suggest that Persian immigrants brought them to the Eastern Mediterranean. However, there is also a possibility that the composition of the manuscript was the result of the immigrants' encounter with the teaching of the Karaite mourners of Zion in Jerusalem. At any rate, the lack of later copies of these commentaries attests to the assimilation of their descendants within the Arabic-speaking Jewish environment in cities such as Jerusalem and Cairo. If you compare this small corpus of early Judeo-Persian Karaite works to the vast corpus of Karaite works in Judeo-Arabic that was copied along the centuries, you might see this quite well. You have a group of manuscripts from the 11th century in early Judeo-Persian that were not copied in later centuries. It stopped in the 11th century. This suggests that these immigrants probably assimilated into the Judeo-Arabic environment. Now, the second type of text, which is very common in early Judeo-Persian, is the documentary material. That is letters and legal documents and commercial documents. And unlike the tafsir, most of the early Judeo-Persian documentary material originates in Bāmiyān, the Afghan Geniza. And it is part of the archive of a Jewish family of landowners and merchants headed by Yehuda ben Daniel, who lived in Bāmiyān in the early 11th century. Now, language-wise, we mentioned the striking differences between early Judeo-Persian and Muslim early New Persian. However, the language let's say, the language of the letters and the legal documents written in Hebrew script coming from this archive does not differ greatly from the Muslim New Persian of the time, written not only in the area of Afghanistan, but in other regions as well. How could we explain this? Well, the literary New Persian in general emerged from Eastern Iran, that is Khorasan, and this is where this Jewish family and their Jewish associates lived. So in other words, this Persian that was spoken and written by this Jewish family was the one and the same that was spoken and written by their Muslim neighbors. Another topic that is of personal interest to me with regard to early Judeo-Persian language and literature is the intellectual history of Iranian Jewry during the pre-Mongol period. The study of the early Judeo-Persian language by people such as Gilbert Lazare, Shaul Shaked, and Ludwig Paul, and many more, facilitated the employment of early Judeo-Persian text as a source for the intellectual history of this Jewry that I will refer to. As shown by Shaked already in the 1980s, Judeo-Persian literature had its beginning not in the 14th century, as was believed by then, by the poets, by Judeo-Persian poets such as Shaheen, we will talk about him soon, but rather much earlier. Cairo Geniza and finds from other synagogues include a wide variety of literary and religious materials written in early Judeo-Persian, not just exegesis and letters, so to speak. Some of these texts date back to the 10th century, which is quite early. The distance from the leading Jewish centers of this Iranian Jewry at that time might lead us to ask the question of, were these Persian-speaking communities isolated from the developments in the Jewish intellectual world? We could take the Karaite exegetical text that I showed you as a case study. In general, the ties of the early Judeo-Persian, let's say, exegetical tradition to the wider Jewish environment have been understudied and underestimated. At times, the early Judeo-Persian commentaries were perceived as rather strange because of the alleged isolation of Iranian Jews from their co-religionists. An exception in this regard is a study by Jeffrey Kahn, who systematically compares early Judeo-Persian grammatical commentary on the Ketuvim to the Dikduk by the Karaite Abu Yaqub Yusuf ibn Nuh, who wrote his book, the Dikduk, in Judeo-Arabic. Now, following his footsteps, I conducted myself in my dissertation a systematic comparison of early Judeo-Persian Karaite manuscripts to Judeo-Arabic Karaite manuscripts. And the outcome was that early Judeo-Persian and Judeo-Arabic corpora differ in many respects. That is true, but it is not very likely that the Judeo-Persian exegetical manuscripts are translations or abridgments of Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic words. However, these are products of Persian-speaking Karaites who seem to have been under the impact of the Jerusalem mourners of Zion. We do not possess any historical evidence pertaining to the context of these two groups, of the Persian Karaites and the mourners of Zion, too much. One possible channel of transmission could be through the travel of some Iranian Karaites to Jerusalem for the purpose of studying at the leading Karaite center of their age, that is Jerusalem, much like the case of the Karaites of Byzantium. And from there, these Iranian Karaites could have helped disseminate the teachings of the Jerusalem school in their homeland. So, bottom line is that rather than being an isolated and cut off from Jewish scholarly circles in other parts of the Islamic world, the authors who wrote in early Judeo-Persian formed an integral part of the Jewish intellectual sphere. They exhibit awareness of recent developments in Jewish exegesis under the reign of Islam, particularly in the Arabic-speaking sphere, and they are ready to incorporate these materials in their work. So while they manage either to commentate,
please switch off your microphones, please. Haim, are you here?
Yes, I didn't.
Okay, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Mm-hmm.
Yes, sorry.
It's okay. So, what I would like to say here, that unlike what was perceived in the past, early Judeo-Persian literature is not isolated or cut off from the rest of the world. You just have to look in the right place. So If you compare exegesis, early Judeo-Persian exegesis, don't look for parallels or influence in Rashi or Radak. Look for influence in Yefet ben Eli and Ibn Nuh, who were in Jerusalem. Now, so this is an example of how the study of the early Judeo-Persian language could affect and could have a major influence on the study of the history of Iranian Jewry. Another interesting topic that appears in early Judeo-Persian texts is bilingualism. The authors of the commentaries mentioned above were not the only Judeo-Iranian group that was literate in Judeo-Arabic or in Arabic. Several pieces of evidence also point to some degree of Arabic proficiency among Persian-speaking Jews in Khuzestan, in Azerbaijan, and even in Bāmiyān, located, as you know, on the edges of the Iranian world. The most intriguing case, in my opinion at least, is that of the Khuzestani Jews. As shown by Shaked, the Cairo Geniza contains several letters displaying hybrid writing, in which the author alternates between early Judeo-Persian and Arabic script. The writers were probably merchants from southwestern Iran, because their dialect of early Judeo-Persian fits that of the Khuzestani type. These merchants were well assimilated in the Arabic-speaking world and culture, and were able to shift between Persian and Arabic quite freely. This is an example of one of these letters. The following text contains personal notes of a certain merchant from the beginning of the 11th century. And here he switches in the middle of a sentence sometimes between Judeo-Persian and Arabic. And from this letter, we can learn how the author perceived each language used in the document. Persian was his native language and part of his Jewish heritage. He felt natural to write it in Hebrew script. He would not imagine writing it in Arabic script. By contrast, his Arabic was not part of his, let's say, Jewish heritage. He may have spent enough time in an Arabic-speaking, probably non-Jewish milieu. And that's how he became fluent in speaking and writing Arabic. Probably his commercial associate who were speaking Arabic. So this is another interesting phenomenon from which we can learn the attitude maybe of Persian speakers in the first centuries of Islam towards their language or Judeo-Persian. So to sum up the discussion of early Judeo-Persian, we can mention again its linguistic traits that have, let's see, I would say even priceless value for the study of the emergence of early New Persian in general and Iranian dialectology after the advent of Islam. And in addition, these early Judeo-Persian texts are the most important source for Jewish history in pre-Mongol Iran. Now I will move on to discuss the next phase in the life of Judeo-Persian, which is classical Judeo-Persian from the post-Mongol period. The watershed moment in the history of Iranian Jewry is the arrival of the Mongols. The Mongol invasion had devastating consequences for the Jewish communities on Iran. Not only them, but we're speaking about Jews today. And especially those in eastern territories. That the communities of the eastern Iran dissolved when the Mongols came is apparent from a group of several dozen tombstones of the Jewish community of Firuzkoh, the capital of the Hurrid dynasty, which is placed today in central Afghanistan. This is a very famous archaeological site that belonged to the city of Firuzkoh, the minaret of Jam. Now, most of the tombstones are datable to the second half of the 12th century and the early 13th century. The date inscribed on the latest tombstone is arguable, but should be sometime again in the early 13th century when the Mongols conquered and destroyed the city. We do not know what was the fate of the Jews of eastern Iran and of Firuzkoh in particular. But as I said in the beginning of my lecture, it is possible that those who managed to survive fled to the western territories of the Iranian plateau. This is where the Mongol Ilkhanid rulers were sitting. And under these Ilkhans, a new phase of literary production starts for the Jews of Iran. The works that were composed from the 13th century onwards fall into a wide array of genres: Bible translations, midrashim, poetry, and many more. And these writings originate from educated Jews who were familiar with the masterpieces of classical Persian literature, and they even imitated them. In terms of language, Early Judeo-Persian gave way to classical Judeo-Persian, which is generally free from dialectal influences. It does not differ much from standard literary Persian, except for script, Hebrew script against Arabic script, orthography, where some short vowels are indicated by like the letters Vav and Yod, or there are different conventions for consonants, and lexicon, the Hebrew and Aramaic expressions. It should be taken also into account that any deviations from the classical Persian or classical Judeo-Persian may be attributable to later copyists whose level of literacy and education varies a great deal. I could show you examples during the discussion time. Now, I have two reservations personally concerning this complete or correspondence or insignificance of classical Judeo-Persian for linguistic studies, unlike early Judeo-Persian. We said that classical Judeo-Persian does not differ much from standard literary Persian of the time. Well, we could also, the reservations I have, the first one is that there are Judeo-Persian letters from the post-Mongol period, from the 15th and 16th and 19th and 20th century. And they have not been studied in earnest. In many cases, the language of these letters is quite natural. The authors had no aesthetic pretensions, and the language they used reflect their vernacular to some extent, at least, just like in early Judeo-Persian. Another reservation I have are the Bible translations that are datable to the 13th and 15th century, after the Mongol invasion, and they may reflect a relatively early stage of Judeo-Persian. Their authors possibly relied on pre-Mongol materials which were available to them. These are two examples of these important, very important Bible translations, one coming from, one preserved at the British Library today, and another one at the Vatican. Again, if you have, I would love to discuss them more in the discussion, in the questions. The last topic, which is related to classical Judeo-Persian, which is, we cannot ignore it, of course, when we talk about classical Judeo-Persian language and literature, is the emergence of Judeo-Persian poetry. In the 14th century, Judeo-Persian poetry gained much popularity among Jews. The first known poet is Maulana Shaheen Shirazi of Shiraz. He lived during the time of the last Ilkhanid ruler, Abu Sa'id. He also dedicated some of his work to Abu Sa'id. And he composed several epic poems based on the biblical narrative, and they rely heavily on the Perso-Islamic literary traditions. The work, one of the works is, the first work he wrote was Musaname, which describes the life of Moses and is based on the narrative parts of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Ardashirname, which is an interesting adaptation of the Scroll of Esther. Ezraname, which tells the tales of Cyrus and Ezra the scribe. And Bereshitname, which tells the entire story of the book of Genesis. Another known poet is Imrani. The one who inherited his position of Shaheen. He is the second famous poet in Judeo-Persian poetry and literature. He composed around 13 works, most of which in verse form. And his works can be belong to different genres. He has epic poems, he has Jewish narratives, didactic poems, lyric poems, many more. Unlike Shaheen, Emrani does not seem to integrate Islamic traditions. One thing that is very interesting about Shaheen is that he integrates many Islamic traditions that are strange to or foreign to the Jewish tradition. This aspect of Shaheen is currently studied by Dr. Yulia Rabinovich of the Hebrew University, who is my former dissertation supervisor, along with Shaul Shaked. Now, unlike Shaheen, who does that, Imrani does not do that. He follows strictly the Jewish tradition, but at the same time, his work titled Fathnameh, the Book of Conquest, which narrates the book of Joshua and Ruth and 1st and 2nd Samuel, draws much from the Persian epic tradition, particularly the Shahnameh. The impressive number of manuscripts containing the works of Shaheen and Imrani attest to their popularity in the Persian-speaking Jewish world. With the literary achievement of the two, others followed soon. Their followers used the poetic convention set by Shaheen and Imrani and retold other parts of the biblical narrative that Shaheen and Imrani did not include. For example, a poet of the 17th century called Khajeh Bukharai compiled a poem called Daniel Nameh, which is in fact an adaptation of the book of Daniel into verse. Another poet from the same century is Aaron ben Mashiach, who took the book of Judges, Shoftim, and composed the work Shoftim Nameh. So you see later on, other poets, other Judeo-Persian poets in later periods also composed many poems in Judeo-Persian based on the narrative of the Bible or even the Mishnah. Pirkei Avot was particularly popular among the Iranian Jews. This is a very important part of classical Judeo-Persian language and literature, the poems. Now, I would like to end with a short display of some of the recent publications in the field. So editions and studies of Judeo-Persian language and literature were published throughout the 20th century. However, since the early 2000s, there is a revival in the study of Judeo-Persian language and literature. And if I name a few publications from the last decade, we have a grammar of Early Judeo-Persian by Ludwig Paul, and a translation of some of Emrani's poetry of the Fathnameh, the Book of Conquest by Vera Morin, an edited volume containing many articles dealing with Persian culture and Jewish content and Judeo-Iranian culture, and even a few weeks ago, The Prince and the Sufi, Zadeva Sufi, famous work in Judeo-Persian that was published by Dalia Yasharpour. So you see that there is some revival of these studies, and I hope it will go on. There are, of course, many other questions and to resolve and to discuss, but I think I've managed to give you the state of affairs of early Judeo-Persian studies and Judeo-Persian, and thank you very much.